Welcome to Managerial Accounting for the fall 2022 semester. Today is November 10th. So just wanted to remind you, if you haven't yet submitted your annual report project that was due this past Tuesday, please get that in as soon as possible. If you need to check in with me about an extension on that for some reason, feel free to do that as well. Just send me an email. And then today we'll be finishing up chapter 25. So the chapter 25 exercises should be submitted in CNOW by the end of the day. Chapter 25, as you know, is the final chapter on our third exam. And so we have a review session scheduled for that exam on Monday morning, 9:30 to 10:30. And if you are able to join us, if you don't have another commitment at that time, please sign up in Starfish and then join us on Zoom. If you can only come for part of it, that's fine. Beginning or end, that's perfectly fine. My expectation is we would go through the review set of exercises, the practice set, and make the most of that time that we have. But if there's anything, if you're attending and there's anything else particularly that would be helpful for you to review for that exam, then you can just let me know. Tuesday then, our chapter 25 problem will be due, and you should be ready at that point to take the exam. The exam is officially due on Sunday, the 20th, but as I talked on Tuesday, you know, I realize a lot of people are going to be leaving, maybe going home or going elsewhere for the break that following week, the week of Thanksgiving. There are no classes. So please, I would recommend that you take the exam before you leave for that break if you're leaving campus, just to make sure that it doesn't slip through the cracks once you get to wherever you're going. And next week we will be covering chapter 26, but chapter 26 is not on the exam. So the problem for chapter 26 isn't even due until we get back from that Thanksgiving recess. After Thanksgiving, then we have chapter 27, chapter 28, and our final day of class, just looking ahead here, our final day of class, regularly scheduled class, that's the 30th class day, is December 13th. But we will have already finished chapter 28 at that point. So that really is just an optional review session. So on that day, we might even meet on Zoom rather than meeting on campus if there is anyone who wants or needs to review anything at that time. We have a review session also scheduled for Wednesday, December 14th. I might actually change that officially to the 13th when our regular class time would be. So, or maybe we just do both and see who wants to come to either one. Some people may already have classes on that Wednesday. So I know that's looking a little bit out into the future, but for planning purposes, I want people to be aware of what's going on. All right, so back to our work for today. Our chapter 25, we started on Tuesday on differential analysis and product pricing, which are two separate questions. So we went through on Tuesday the idea of differential analysis, also known as incremental analysis or marginal analysis, where we're really just looking at if we made this decision, what would change? Or you know, we're choosing between these set of alternatives. What are the differences between them? So we really eliminate from our analysis anything that's the same under all scenarios, because it doesn't help us to make a decision if it's not something that's different between the two or among the group. As I told you on Tuesday, all of the exercises we do are looking at just two alternatives, and that certainly simplifies the approach, but it is not necessarily the case that in all circumstances we could narrow our options down to just the best two. That implies that we've been able to throw out the other ones for some reason. So I don't know how you get to this point with just two alternatives without having already done some preliminary analysis like this. So we're looking at two because it makes it easier for us to do the comparison just between two alternatives. But in reality, it's not uncommon to have more than two options that all seem reasonable and appropriate and a good fit for whatever it is we're trying to do. So we have two more exercises that are related to this differential analysis where we have a problem that we're trying to solve or a potential opportunity for our company. We're trying to decide between the best two options. We've already done that as we described it on Tuesday, that brainstorming. We've identified a problem or an opportunity. We've brainstormed what are the possible options here without any kind of judgment. We then go through that list and throw out the ones that just don't fit in with our game plan, don't seem reasonable, are too cost prohibitive, the time frame isn't right, or some other reason that we just say we're not even going to look at that alternative right now. With what we have left, we then engage in some analysis about which of these options makes sense and put together a more detailed cost benefit, cost revenue kind of analysis to decide, okay, which one of these do we really want to say this is the best, the single best alternative for our company to help us either take advantage of this opportunity or to solve this problem that we've discovered. So we have two more of those incremental analysis exercises to work through, two different scenarios from what we've seen already. And then we're going to look at the second part of the chapter, which is the question of product pricing. So here we are. This is exercise 6 in chapter 25. So hopefully you all have your Cengage exercises open. And it says Dakota Coffee Company produces Colombian coffee in batches of 7,500 pounds. The standard quantity of materials required in the process is 7,500 pounds, which cost $6 per pound. Colombian coffee can be sold without further processing for $9.80 per pound, or it can be processed further to yield decaf Colombian, which can be sold for $11.60 per pound. The processing into decaf Colombian requires additional processing costs of $6,300 per batch. The additional processing will also cause a loss of 5% of the product due to evaporation. In other words, you don't have 7,500 pounds of decaf to sell at the end of the process. And so one thing I just need to say up front is this differential analysis that we're looking at is assuming that we can sell whatever we produce. So for those of you who have taken microeconomics or are taking microeconomics, we have the concept, of market structure. Actually, I guess that part, sorry, is covered in macroeconomics, the market structure piece, right? No, I was right. It's microeconomics. Sorry, I just got lost there for a second. So when we think about market structure, there's only one kind of spot on the continuum of a market structure, which is pure competition, where we assume that you can sell everything you produce at whatever the prevailing market rate is. So in this exercise, we have to kind of suspend judgment and take at their word that this company has a market to sell either the 7,500 pounds of regular coffee or the 7,500 pounds minus 5% of decaf at whatever the prevailing market price is, the $9.80 for regular and $11.60 for decaf. So we have to make that assumption going into this. In reality, though, for most companies, that is not the case, that they can sell everything they can produce without affecting the price. And so the question of which one should they sell, regular or decaf, for most companies, it's going to be a mix of the two. So for example, even if we find that decaf is more profitable per pound, that doesn't mean we should sell only decaf. It might mean that we sell as much decaf, or we produce as much decaf as we can that we can sell, and whatever's left we produce regular. So as is frequently the case, we are really simplifying this by assuming that we want to sell all of one or all of the other, as opposed to some kind of a mix of those products, which is a much more realistic scenario. But let's go ahead with our calculations here. So as we get started, let me ask you the question. Of this 7,500 pounds that costs $6 a pound, should we be including that part in our analysis? Now, I'm not answering the question of, is it included in this exercise? That's not the question I'm asking. But is it a differential cost, or can we ignore that part? And based on what we talked about on Tuesday, the answer is we can really ignore the first $6 a pound if we've already decided we're selling one of these. If the question is not, do we make money to sell either product? If we start out with the assumption that we will make money on either product, we can ignore that $6 a pound cost for the raw materials, because it is not a differential cost. That $6 a pound for the raw material is the same whether we produce just the regular coffee or the decaf. Again, I am not suggesting that we don't, that the exercise doesn't have us include that, but I'm suggesting it doesn't need to be in there, and probably it actually shouldn't be in there. I told you on Tuesday there were a couple things in this exercise set that would allow me to talk about, what might be a cleaner way of looking at this, and this is one of those scenarios. So our first column, though, is for selling the regular. We know that the regular can be sold for $9.80 per pound, and that we will have 7,500 pounds per batch to sell. So 7,500 pounds at $9.80 per pound. Our revenues would be $73,500. The cost then is the $6 per pound. And as I told you, that $6 is not a differential cost. And so it really does not need to be, really does not need to be included in this differential analysis. By definition, it is not a differential cost and therefore should not be included. It does, however, give us a more accurate bottom line here with the, going to be having trouble typing today. So that profit or loss on that bottom line, if we did not include, sorry, I probably made that super big. If we did not include the $6 cost, might be a little bit misleading. So let's look at alternative 2. So alternative 2 is we turn it into decaf. We know that we're going to lose 5% of the product to evaporation. So 7,500 pounds, but we're only going to end up with 95% of that. We're only going to end up with 7,000. Sorry, let's scroll down first. We're only going to end up with 7,500 pounds times 95% is 7,125 pounds of product that can be sold. Okay, so if we have 71.25 to sell, and we're told we can sell that, the decaf, for, where is it? $11.60 per pound. Our revenues from that, 7,125 pounds at $11.60 each, our revenues would be $82.65. However, on top of the cost of the raw materials at $6 a pound, we have an additional $6,300 in processing cost per batch. So we go from 45,000 total cost up to 51,300. And so as we compare the two alternatives, our revenues would go up by 91.50, but our costs would go up by 6,300. And so the advantage of producing decaf is an additional 28.50 in profit. Everybody agree with those numbers? Should Dakota Company sell Colombian coffee or process it further and sell decaf? With the assumptions that I laid out before we started doing any of the calculations, we assume that we can sell the entire batch. Yep, so we should process it further because we'd make almost $3,000 more. So we're asked to determine the price at which there would be neither an advantage nor a disadvantage for processing further and selling decaf Colombian. So there's a couple different ways that we can approach this. I think we'll go with if I can get my mouse to work. We'll go with the most straightforward way. So we know that the additional profit is $2,850. And that is for 7,125 pounds of product. So we make an extra $28.50 in total for 7,125 pounds, or an extra 40 cents per pound. So if we sold it for 40 cents less per pound, that's where we would be ambivalent. We would have neither an advantage nor a disadvantage. Our net profit would be exactly the same. So currently our selling price is $11.60. If we lowered that to $11.20, that's the point where it wouldn't matter. We would make exactly the same amount, whether we sold it as regular or processed it further into decaf. So back to my economics comments. So should we lower the price by 40 cents or 35 cents per pound? And the answer to that, based on our initial assumptions, is no, because we've already made the assumption we can sell all of it at $11.60. So what would be the purpose in lowering the price? If we are in a purely competitive market and we can sell everything we have without impacting the price, there's no logic, no rational explanation for lowering the price if we can sell all we have at a higher price. Let's clear the work there. Okay. So any questions about that? Again, just one more very practical business application of this concept of incremental analysis. Recognizing that we have really vastly simplified this, but if you can, if you take to, keep in mind the concept of differential analysis, you can apply these same principles in a more complex or more complicated scenario as well. You just want to be very clear about what we talked about last time as far as those sunk costs, the costs that cannot be affected by a future decision we might make because they're dependent on a decision that's already been made in the past. It's too late not to make that same decision in the past. So the only costs and revenues that we should be considering are ones that we can impact in the future. If there aren't any questions, we'll move on to our final exercise about differential analysis. And as you can see at the top of this exercise, this is a decision on accepting additional business. So I want to remind you about our discussion about capacity and what that term means. So this is review. We talked about in an earlier chapter, it's come up actually in a few different chapters, that there are really three different types of capacity, three different versions of capacity. There's theoretical, practical, and normal capacity. And so theoretical capacity is that perfect world where we do not live. And so it's nice to talk about, but it's not very wide. It's not relevant to our decision making because it's never going to happen. Practical capacity is what we're talking about here, where it says Homestead Jeans has an annual plant capacity of 65,000 units. They could, in reality, make up to 65,000 units. That is doable for them. It's within the realm of possibility with their existing capacity, their existing machinery and the equipment that they have, the workforce that they have. They could make 65,000 units. However, their current production is only 45,000 units. So again, back to a discussion we've had in earlier chapters, if they can make 65,000 units, why are they only making 45,000 now? What would be the possible business explanation for that? They can make 65,000, but they're only making 45,000. Yeah, because there's not enough demand. They're making 45,000 because they can sell 45,000. So the next line says monthly fixed costs are $54,000. If we upped our production from 45 to 50 or 55 or 62 or even 65,000, are those monthly fixed costs going to change? If they are fixed, are they going to change if we increase our production? Because they're fixed, they're not going to change. The other side of that is if we lower our production to 40 or 35, are those fixed costs going to change? No. We'll just be spreading them over a different number of units. So the fixed cost per unit will change, but our total fixed costs are unaffected by the number that we produce. Okay. Variable costs are $29 per unit. If we make more units, we're going to have more variable cost, right? By definition. The $29 per unit is a good number for our entire regular normal operating range, but that $29 per unit is going to stay constant per unit regardless of how many units we produce and sell within our relevant operating range. The present selling price is $42 per unit. Okay, so On November 12th of the current year, the company received an offer from Dawkins Company for 18,000 units of the product at $32 each. That's $10 less than we're selling them for right now. The first question we have to ask is, do we have the capacity to produce them? And the answer is clearly yes, we do. We are only producing 45,000 now. We have capacity to produce 65,000 without changing any of our fixed costs. So we have excess capacity of 20,000 units. Bringing in these 18,000 units is possible. And so once we've answered that question, the next question is, but does it make sense for us? It tells us the additional business is not expected to affect the domestic selling price or quantity of sales. These are going to be sold in a foreign country owned under a separate brand name that Dawkins Company sells. So that's an important concept as well. There's an important question to ask. Is this, if we sell these, is it going to change, the market for the $42 pairs of jeans? We don't want to impact that, but we're sure that no, that this will have no impact on our ability to sell the first 45,000 units at $42 each. We're going to fill in the differential analysis table in part A in just a moment. But before we do that, I just want you to think about this in terms of what we have covered in an earlier chapter. If the units, the extra pairs can be sold for $32 each, and the variable costs are $29 each, what is the contribution margin? What would be the contribution margin for those extra pairs of jeans, the extra 18,000 units? What is the contribution margin if we can sell them for $32 and they cost us $29 extra to produce? Because we've already established the fixed costs don't change. How much more do we make on each pair of jeans? If we sell them for 32 and it costs 29, just $3. Yep. So that's all I was asking. $3 of additional contribution margin for each additional pair we can sell. 18,000 pairs of jeans, each contributing an additional $3 to our contribution margin. That's $54,000. Before we even fill out this table, we know our bottom line is going to improve by $54,000. So this is a pretty simple question without even filling out the table. Should they accept the order? Yes, because they'll contribute $54,000 to the bottom line. I'm just going to fill that in right now. We should accept the order because we'll make $54,000 more. Yes, sir.
So that would cover all of the monthly fixed costs then?
You could think of it that way, but really the fixed costs are irrelevant to this exercise because those fixed costs are not a differential cost. We're going to have those $54,000 in fixed costs, whether we take the order or don't take the order. Okay. So let's go with the reject the order. And it's kind of goofy the way they have this set up, but the reason it's set up, the table is set up like this, is so that we can, keep that standard kind of approach. Here's alternative 1, here's alternative 2, what's the difference? But rejecting the order means the status quo, nothing would change. It doesn't mean that the company doesn't make any money, but it means it makes exactly the same amount of money as they would have made before they even knew this order was a possibility. So rejecting the order wouldn't change their revenues, it wouldn't change their costs, and it would not change their profits. But how about accepting the order? 18,000 pairs of jeans that we would sell for $32 each. Our revenues would increase Remember, we're doing the differential analysis, how much would change? We do not need to include in here the selling of the first 45,000 pairs at $42 per unit. We could have, let me erase that from the screen. We could have included that in these first columns. If we reject the order, our revenues would only be 45,000 pairs at $42. But then in the second column, we'd have to include those same numbers again, plus the increase from accepting the order. As we've been saying, we only want to include the information that is different. By putting, give me 1 second here. The total revenues without the special order would be $1,890,000. If we put that number in the first column, and then we put it in the second column plus the 576, it's going to make it more difficult for us to really focus in on what's different or what would change if we made this decision. So we really are better off not to include any information about those first 45,000 pairs, because that's not what we're deciding on. We already know what's happening with those. How about our variable manufacturing costs? 18,000 pairs at $29 in variable costs, 522,000. And so again, we already knew before we even did that part, before we even filled in the table in part A, that this was going to be the right decision for us, the best decision for us. But as we answer the questions to part B, this is the topic that we already discussed. Having unused capacity available is relevant to this decision. If we did not have capacity, let's say, let's go back to these numbers. Let's say our current production was 50,000 already. Then we'd only have excess capacity of 15,000. And we'd have to tell Dawkins Company, we can't do 18,000. How about 15,000? We would not want to give up any of the 45,000 units that we're already selling that have $10 in additional contribution margin. If Dawkins came back in that scenario, if we told Dawkins we can only do 15,000 and they came back and said, yeah, we don't want to do any, then we would have to rerun the analysis. We would have to redo it to say, now what would change? If we gave up 3,000 of the $42 sales and went with the $32 sales so that we could sell all 65,000 units, what would that look like? So there might be some alternative scenarios that require a few different calculations. But based on the information we have here, it was critical to know that we could do that without impacting our current level of sales. The differential in revenue is more than the differential cost. We already knew that, again, before we did part A, because there was a $3 positive contribution margin for each one of those extra pairs. Thus, accepting this additional business will result in a net profit. So what is the minimum price per unit that would produce a positive contribution margin? We don't need to make this any harder than it is. Round to 2 decimal places. So we're going out to the cents place. If the variable costs are $29, if we sell them for just 1 cent more than that, we're making money. So we don't have to do any more difficult calculation than that. Just think it through. If they cost us $29 to produce, if we can bring in $29.01, we're better off to produce them. Any questions about the concept of differential analysis We went through several exercises related to this just to kind of give you the sense of the great number of areas where a company might use this concept of just looking at, here's what we're doing now. What would change if we did this? And only focusing in on those pieces that change, the pieces that can impact our decision-making process. So that's a really important way of looking at decision-making. That we don't really need all the information. We only need the information that can impact our decision. And sometimes putting extra information out there, such as in one of the exercises we did on Tuesday, we were given information about the book value, the original cost, the accumulated depreciation on a piece of equipment that we were using. And none of that's relevant to our decision-making because we already bought that equipment. We've already used it for however many years. That's based on a past decision that we cannot change now. Too late to go back and not buy that equipment. So we don't need to even talk about that. The only thing we need to talk about is what would change or what can we change in the future. And in that particular exercise, we did include in the analysis how much we could get if we sold that old piece of equipment. It was something like $250,000 or something. So any questions about differential analysis before we move on? Okay. So let's go to the last portion of the chapter. And we're going to be talking about in our final 3 exercises, the idea of how do we set prices? How do we set the price of the product that we are going to sell? So everything we have, all of the information we have talked about up to this point in the semester, starting with chapter 15, when we first introduced the idea of product cost. And we know the 3 different costs that go into into producing a product. Direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. We've spent several chapters talking about how we assign those costs, how we know the actual costs. We've talked about allocating support department costs and allocating joint costs of production. And we've talked about doing CVP type analysis based on the idea of contribution margin we just reviewed in that last exercise. So with all of that knowledge that we have now, as we are approaching the end of the semester, one thing that has been mentioned several times, why do we need to know about our costs? Well, because it helps us to know what price we should be charging our customers. But this is the first time we've really talked about how do we set that price though? Knowing the underlying cost of producing a product helps us to set the price, but that's not always the way that we set the price. And so you can see on this screen a couple of different ways of setting the price of a product. And we're going to be looking at that, like I said, in the next couple exercises. So we can set the price based on the amount we want to make on the product. So kind of a cost plus approach. And that's what's described really in that purple box or that purple option at the bottom. Setting the price high enough to cover all of our costs and expenses and then provide a reasonable profit. Now, I cannot define for you what's a reasonable profit. What a grocery store thinks is a reasonable profit on a can of corn is very different than what a heavy manufacturer of equipment believes is an appropriate profit for that type of production. So what I mean is profit margin varies greatly from industry to industry. But we can set a price based on that. So again, that kind of cost plus approach. So here's the cost, add on top of it that markup that we need, or we can set our price based on what the market will bear and determine from there what our costs need to be. So I've already, feels like today, feels like in the last couple of weeks, everything we talk about is related to economics, but that really, it's true in this instance as well. How much control we have over the price we set is very much dependent on the type of market structure. So if you are if you're selling a product that lots of other people are selling, you may not have any price control. You may be what is known as a price taker. Because you have to, if you charge less than the market, the prevailing price in the market, you're just going to cut your revenues. If you charge more than the prevailing price in the market and lots of other people are selling the same thing at a lower price, nobody's going to buy your product. So you do still have the ability to set your price, but it may not be the best business decision. And so if you're in a market structure that's close to pure competition, you don't get to set your price. And so you may have to do that target pricing where you take the price that's in the market and then determine what can we spend to produce this product. If you are a pure monopoly, on the other hand, or if you are an oligopoly, or even monopolistic competition, you do have some price control. If you're a monopoly, you are a price maker. You're the only one who sells it. You get to decide the price. If you're one of those other intermediate forms, such as oligopoly, where there's just a handful of sellers, or a monopolistic competition where there might be a lot of sellers, but they differentiate their product in some way because it has features that other products don't have, because of where you're selling it, or something like that. If you are in those market structures, you do have some ability to set your price or change your price from what other people are charging. Just a quick example of that. If you want to buy a half gallon of milk, if you go into the local 7-Eleven or whatever I don't know what kind of convenience stores are around here. If you go into the convenience store, you're going to be paying a lot more than if you go to a supermarket, right? It's the same milk. It might even be exactly the same brand, but you're paying for the convenience of getting it at your corner store that you can just walk there. But it's the same product, the same milk as they're selling in the supermarket. So as I said, there are a few different ways that make sense to set the price that you're going to charge. Demand-based method, as you can see on this slide. If there's high demand for our product, especially if we're one of the few people selling it, then we can afford to set the price high. People are going to buy it anyway. Another economics term that's relevant here is the concept of price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand refers to how sensitive consumers are to a change in price. And so a product that's in high demand, consumers may not care how much the price changes, or will be less sensitive to a change in price. And so you can raise the price without really impacting your overall profit, or by increasing your overall profit. Even if you sell fewer units, you might make more money in total. The goal is rarely to sell as many units as you can. The goal would typically be for a business to maximize your bottom line, to maximize the profitability. And sometimes that may mean raising the price, even if it costs you units of sales, because you might make more per unit to make up for that. The competition-based method is what I was already describing. If you are in a market where there are lots of other sellers, you may not be able to charge a price that's different than what everyone else is charging. Because people aren't going to buy your product if you're charging more than other people and they see them as the same product. Oops. Okay. So I already mentioned the idea of cost plus pricing, where we say, here's how much it's costing us. Here's how much we should charge for it. We just saw in the last exercise why sometimes we might want to avoid or ignore the fixed costs when, you know, we're talking about that special order of jeans in that last exercise. So of the three options that you see on this page, product cost would be direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. Total cost would include those other costs that we've been talking about in the past few chapters, including support department costs that are really part of the cost of the product, but may not be a direct, they're a period cost, not one of those three, direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. And the variable cost method, as I just described, would ignore the fixed costs because we know that those fixed costs aren't going to change. Yes, we need to cover them, but we're going to be covering them with that contribution margin. So I think at this point we can go to our next exercise. So this is exercise 8. La Femme Accessories Incorporated produces women's handbags. The cost of producing 800 handbags is as follows. So a total of $32,000. We have selling and administrative expenses of $17,000. The management desires a profit equal to 22% of invested assets of $250,000. So this is this reminds us of what we talked about in the earlier chapter when we talked about evaluating management performance, and we've talked about return on investment, and that's what they're referencing here. The return on investment. They have a targeted return on investment of 22%. And so if I were to do that math, 22% of $250,000 is $55,000. And so management is saying, we need to bring in $55,000 in operating income because that's what's expected. That's the desired ROI, return on investment. We need to bring in $55,000. So that's actually our answer to letter A. Determine the amount of desired profit from the production and sale of handbags. If I can get this lined up correctly, there we go, $55,000. To determine the product cost per unit for the production of 800 handbags. So product cost includes just direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead, $32,000. So $32,000 divided by 800 handbags. The product cost per unit is $40. Determine the product cost markup as a percent for handbags. So let me get my writing tool up here. So we need to cover the $55,000 in profit. We also need to cover whoops, hang on. I need to scroll up and I can't. Let me go back up here. Okay. So we also need to cover these $17,000 in selling and administrative expenses. Sorry, shouldn't be a space in there. So we also need to cover that $17,000 in selling and administrative expenses. So 55 and 17, we need to, in addition to the product cost, which was 32,000, I can see that right at the top of my screen here. In addition to that 32,000, we need to cover the 17,000 in period costs and the 55,000 in desired profit. So the question of the markup percentage, we need to add $72,000 on top of the 32,000 in product cost. So 72,000 divided by 32,000 is 2.25 or 225%. We need to mark up the cost of these bags by 225%. And I want to throw a couple more words on there just to explain, if you're not familiar with these terms, markup and margin. I think I probably have mentioned this in an earlier class. Markup means you start with the cost and add on top of it, so you're going up. Margin, we start with the price and go down. So margin is a percent of the selling price. Markup is a percent of the cost. What we are asked in letter C is to find the markup. So we're starting from the cost of 32,000 and saying how much do we have to add on top of that. So it's a 225% markup from the cost to get to where we want to be, that target price of where we make 22% of invested assets, where we make that 55,000. So we already established in letter B that our cost is $40 per unit. We need to add 225% on top of that. 225% of the $40 is $90. And so the selling price, in order to achieve what we're aiming for, in order to achieve what we are aiming for, we would need to sell these bags for $130. Make sense? So that's one way of looking at it. In this exercise, we were doing a normal cost based on the total cost of the product. So we took the product cost, we took the period cost, we added on top of that some desired profit, and we set our price at $130 based on all of that. The question we now have to ask is, can we sell these bags for $130? And I don't know the answer to that. That's beyond the scope of this exercise. But as a business, before we're even making these products, we should be asking that question. We need to charge $130 to give us the profit that we want. If we make them and sell them for $130, is anyone going to buy them? And if not, we may need to rethink this. And we may need to go toward that target cost approach that we're going to see in the next exercise, where we first test the market and decide, we want to make handbags. How much can we sell them for? Okay, how much can we afford to spend on making them if that's how much we can sell them for? It's kind of turning the whole model on its head. Before we go to that next exercise though, does anyone have any questions on this approach? We could do the same basic approach using just the variable cost. We kind of did that a little bit in the last exercise, deciding, can we afford to sell them for $32 if the variable cost is just $29? Okay, there aren't any questions, and I'm going to move on to our next exercise, target costing. And so this is what I was just describing. We do a market survey, maybe we do some market research, and we determine how much do we think is the right price for this product we want to sell. And from that, we determine how much cost we can have in it to still turn a profit. Toyota Motor Corporation uses target costing. Assume that Toyota marketing personnel estimate that the competitive selling price for the Camry in the upcoming model year will need to be $27,000. So before I do anything else, I can already answer question A. What price will Toyota establish for the Camry for the upcoming model year? If they use target costing, they're going to set the price at what they know is the competitive selling price. They know they can only charge $27,000 for it. We don't need, we at this point, because I haven't read any further, we at this point don't know what their cost structure looks like. But the marketing department came in and said, we can only charge $27,000 for that car next year. And so they set the price at $27,000, and then they figure out how much can we afford to spend to make this car if we can sell it for $27,000. Hopefully you can see how that approach is very different than what we did in the last exercise. Assume further that Camry's total unit cost for the upcoming model year is estimated to be $22,500. And that Toyota requires a 20% profit margin, which is equivalent to a 25% markup on total cost. So I've already explained the difference between markup and margin. So margin is the percent of the selling price. Markup is the percent of the cost. So if we were doing like we did in the last exercise and using our cost to determine our selling price, this is what Toyota would be doing. $22,500 in cost. We want a 25% markup on that. Whoops. If they used normal costing, as we covered it in the previous exercise, their market price for next year would be $28,125. So why did we say in letter A that they're only going to charge $27,000 for it? Because they know they can't sell it for $28,125 if they want to be competitive. They can only charge $27,000. So what do we learn from that? What it tells us is this cost of $22,500 is too high. If we produce next year and it costs us $22,500 to produce a Camry, and then we sell it for $27,000, that's a margin of $4,500 per car. So if we make $4,500 per car and the selling price is $27,000, that is, just rounding off, a 16.7% profit margin. That's a problem because Toyota requires a 20% profit margin. We already said they can't raise the price over that 27,000. So what do they need to do? They need to lower their cost. They need to look at what went into or what goes into this 22,500. Where can we trim without compromising the quality and integrity of the product that we're selling? Letter B, since the estimated manufacturing cost exceeds the target cost, Toyota must reduce its total cost to remain competitive within its profit objectives. And let me put one more calculation up there. So if their selling price is 27,000 and they want a 20% profit margin, that means that their cost can only be 80% of that total. This 21,600, 80% of the target selling price. Our costs need to be at 21,600 or lower to maintain that 20% profit margin that the company requires. Right now, our costs are 22,500. We are expecting right now to spend $900 too much on each car, each Camry that we produce. So what do we need to do? We need to trim those costs. We need to look at that, where those costs coming from, where can we achieve some efficiencies? I can't possibly know sitting here in the classroom exactly how they go about doing that. Maybe they need to automate some of their processes. Maybe they need to look at sourcing their materials from a less expensive source. I don't know. The only thing I know for sure is, based on what we're told, they can't sell the car for $28,125, which is what they would need to do at the current cost. They can't sell it for that because it's not competitive. But if they sell it for the 27,000 without changing their costs, the company's not going to be happy because they require a 20% profit margin, which they would not achieve. So you see the difference between normal costing, where we calculate our costs first and then set the price, and target costing, where we set the price and then figure out how much we can spend on making the product. Very different approaches. Which one is the most appropriate depends on how sensitive your customers are to price, and that's the concept of elasticity in economics, and whether there are close competitors. So if we set our price too high, if Toyota sets their price at 28,000, we're told that's not competitive. What that means is customers, instead of buying a Camry for 28,000, will go buy, I have no idea what other, I'm not a car person, but whatever kind of car might be seen as the equivalent to a Camry that's made by some other producer who is selling it in the, in the target price range. Any questions on that? Anybody? Let's move on then to our final exercise for this chapter. Now, on Tuesday, I showed you in the reference materials folder for this chapter. I can just go there. So on Tuesday, I showed you that there is a video here in this chapter folder. I'm not going to show it to you right now. But we are going to finish class early today, and I would strongly recommend that you watch this video on your own. It is important to understand what we're going to be talking about. If you haven't already watched it, please make sure you do watch it. It's not very long. It's only a few minutes long. But what we are going to be talking about in this final exercise is the concept of bottlenecked operations, and that's exactly what you see in that video. See a representation of what it means to be a bottleneck. There is a guy, there was a guy, I should say, he's deceased now, who has written a number of books, management type books, business related books. God bless you. And his name, put his name on the screen. His name is Eli, or Eliyahu is his Goldratt. So his name was Eli Goldratt. He was an Israeli, and he has written a whole bunch of books about business improvement and management. Probably his most famous book is called The Goal. And I really like that book. I like it so much that I have 2 copies of it, because I normally bring one to class and I offer to lend it to anyone who wants to read it. But I keep another copy just in case I need it or I don't get the first one back. The book is really interesting because it is a business improvement kind of book, but it's written like a novel. So it's written as a story. And it tells the story of a guy who runs a factory in a small town, and that factory is kind of the major employer in the town, but the factory's struggling. It's not doing well. And there's a lot of pressure on this guy, personal and professional pressure, to turn the company around, because there's a lot of jobs, a lot of lives in this small town depending on it. And so it tells the story of the kinds of things that he's trying. But in the meantime, like I said, it's not a factual book. It's not a, here's what you have to do. It kind of leads you to the conclusions about business improvement. And I think it's very well written. Many of his other books, like The Critical Chain, and I'm drawing a blank. I have about 5 of his books, 4 or 5. Many of the other books are not written in the same style. They are more of a how-to kind of manual. But I really recommend this book because it really leads you to draw conclusions on your own that are things that you may not have thought about. One of the main focuses that he recognizes is needed for his company is that they change from the push through to pull through production. And that's a term you've heard me talk about before. And Prosper just earlier in class, when I was saying, with that, whoops, the word I meant. When I was saying, why would that jeans company only produce 45,000 if they could produce 65,000? That's a perfect example of pull through production. They're only producing 45,000, not because that's the limit of what they can produce, but that's the limit of what they can sell. And so in the book, The Goal, that's one of the steps that he takes, is recognizing it's the goal, the purpose is not to produce as much as we can. The goal is to meet our customers' demands. And one of the other realizations he has is the idea of unstopping bottlenecks. So, and I don't need to rewrite that because it's already on the screen here, bottlenecked operations. So a bottleneck is a sticking point to production. It's what slows us down. And the example that he gave in the book, the story he tells that makes him have that aha moment. Oh, this is what I need to do. He has a son. He's a family guy, and he has a son. And the son really wants him to go on I don't know if it's Boy Scouts or whatever, but some kind of a group that he's in, like a scout group. And they want to go on a hike on Saturday. And the son is really pressuring the dad to go. And the dad, meanwhile, is thinking, I've got so much work to do. I can't go on this hike. But he kind of gets pressured into going, he knows it's the right thing to do. And so he goes on this hike, and there's a whole bunch of scouts. And if you've ever been on a hike, and I've been a scout leader for years, so I'm very familiar with this. If you've ever been on a hike with a group of kids, you know that there are some kids who don't really want to be there, and some kids who might be less physically fit than others. And so you've got lots of different abilities in that group. And so this is what would happen if you didn't make any effort to control it. All the kids start out on the trail together. And the ones who are faster, the ones who are excited to be there, are running ahead, and you end up with huge gaps in the line. And then you've got the little kid who really doesn't want to be there. There was something else he wanted to do that day, or maybe he's not very physically fit or physically active, forgot to wear the right shoes. He doesn't even have the laces tied. And he's the bottleneck. And the kids, maybe it's a narrow path. That's what happens in this story in the book. And so the kids that are behind that guy are stuck, right? And they're bumping up behind him, and they're like, come on, hurry up, we gotta go. But they can't get around him because the path is too narrow. The guy in the book sees that happening, and he says, when he has the front group, the front runners stop, and they all gather up, and he says, you know what? We're going to take the little guy who's not very fast, and he's going to be the pace setter. We're going to put him at the front of the group, and everyone's going to follow his pace. And that way we'll all stick together. And the guys who want to be a little faster, the guys who want to catch up with the front runners, aren't going to need to do that. We're just going to all go the pace of the guy who's in front. You following this story? And so he has this happen. He implements this change. He puts the slowest person out front, and he watches what happens. And guess what? The whole group stays together. There's no more real jostling and pushing on the trail, because everybody's going the same pace, and there aren't two separate groups, and everybody's, there's no group out in front that maybe is unsafe because there's no adult supervision there or whatever. And he starts thinking, I could do this in the workplace. He starts analyzing the processes at his factory, and he realizes that there's one machine that is the bottleneck for his company, that dictates how much they can produce. Because at that time, everything in the factory has to go through this one machine, and they just don't have enough capacity. And so what's happening? The people who are doing the steps in production before it gets to that bottleneck machine just keep producing and producing, because they're producing because they can. And so there's products stacking up behind this one machine, because the machine can't handle all of it. And so now we've got all of this excess product sitting there. We have time and materials in that product, and it's just sitting there. And the people who are running the processes that are after the bottleneck don't have anything to do, because the bottleneck is holding them up. It's not providing them with the product they need to keep working on the process. And so he goes back to the workplace, and he says, first, we're gonna figure out if all the product actually does need to go through this one step, because maybe we can bypass it and speed this process up. And two, we're gonna stop pushing so much product at this bottleneck that we know it can't handle. We're gonna make this more orderly. And I don't, that's all I need to tell you about the book. I just want you to recognize what that concept of a bottleneck is. And when you watch the video that I have linked in Brightspace, you'll see a really cool way that that we can make it a more orderly and faster flow through when we use this concept of pull through production, when we identify the bottlenecks and let those bottlenecks determine the rate at which we do all the other steps. So we don't have a bunch of inventory stacking up, so that we don't have a bunch of machines that are sitting idle, so that we don't have a bunch of product that we can't sell that we're producing just because we can. We start producing because we can sell it, not because we have a machine sitting there that's not doing anything. Let's go to our final exercise. Product decisions under bottlenecked operations. Mill Metals Inc. has 3 grades of metal product, type 5, type 10, and type 20. Financial data for the 3 grades are as follows. And so you can see that the operating income per unit is 20 cents for type 5, 260 for type 10, and 440 for type 20. Mill's operations require all 3 grades to be melted in a furnace before being formed. The furnace runs 24/7, 365, and is a production bottleneck. And so what does that mean? It is that furnace that determines how much we can produce. The furnace is the bottleneck. We can't make it go any faster. We can't use it for any more hours. At least in the short term, our productive capacity is determined by how much we can put through that furnace. Now, in the long term, maybe we should invest in another furnace. Maybe. But as of right now, our productive capacity is determined completely by that furnace. And so when we're looking at how do we maximize our profit, we know we can't produce, so these numbers are for 5,000 units, but we know that we can't produce an unlimited quantity of this stuff, the type 5, type 10, or type 20. Our productive capacity is determined by this production bottleneck. You can see that type 5 takes 6 hours in the furnace, as does type 10, but type 20 takes 12 hours in the furnace. And so when we're deciding which one we should produce, how do we maximize the usage of that furnace, that bottleneck in our productive capacity, rather than looking at the contribution margin per unit? I don't see, I should make that a little. Oops, I went the wrong way. Just trying to fit it all on the screen here. There we go. So when we are deciding how best to use that furnace, we want to look at not how much do we make per pound of steel. Is that what this is? Metal product, it's non-specific. So how much we should make of the metal product isn't determined by how much we make per pound of that product or per unit of that product, but we want to maximize the use of the furnace. And so the question we really need to ask is, how much can we make per unit of that furnace's productive capacity? So type 20 takes twice as much of that furnace time to produce 1 unit. So if we don't make more than twice as much money on type 20, we shouldn't be producing it. The marketing department is considering a new marketing and sales campaign. Determine the unit contribution margin per furnace hour will assist in making your decision. Round the unit contribution margin to 2 decimal places. So type 5 has an operating income per unit of type 5 of 20 cents, but it takes 6 hours in the furnace to get that 20 cents. So 20 cents, 20 cents per unit. I'm going to just say pound, okay? 20 cents per pound of type 5. If it takes 6 hours to produce it, one second. So we have point. I feel like I'm missing something here, but I feel like I skipped over something, as I sometimes do. Okay. Yeah, so this is contribution margin. I skipped over something in my reading. So it's contribution margin, and this operating income is including or is after the fixed cost. So I need to back up for a moment. And instead of looking at our operating income, I was just misreading that. I need to just focus on this. There we go. Because the question is about contribution margin per unit, per furnace hour. So let's do type 5. If we have 43,000 in revenues and 34,000 in variable cost, our contribution margin is $9,000. And that's for 5,000 units. And each unit, so that's $1.80 in contribution margin per unit of the product, but each unit takes 6 hours in the furnace. So that is 30 cents. I'm gonna write this out on the screen in case I'm not being clear. So we have $9,000 in contribution margin, and that's for 5,000 units of type 5, which is $1.80 in contribution margin per unit per pound of type 5. But each one of those pounds takes 6 hours in the furnace. And so the answer to our unit contribution margin per furnace hour is 30 cents. Does that make sense? So we can do the same thing then for type 10. Type 10 has a much bigger contribution margin, 49,000 in revenues minus 28,000 in variable cost. We have a contribution margin of $21,000. Again, that's for 5,000 units. So that's $4.20 in contribution margin per unit of type 10. But again, it takes 6 hours in the furnace. So that's, whoops, no, that's 70 cents per furnace hour. And so if those were only 2 choices, we'd say, well, we should be producing type 10 because we make more per unit of the constrained resource. The constrained resource, or the bottleneck, is what dictates how much we can actually produce. And so then go ahead with type 20, revenues minus variable costs, $30,000 in contribution margin, again for 5,000 units. And that's $6 per unit in contribution margin. But each one of those units takes twice as long, 12 hours in the furnace. And so even though it looks, when we look at this, it looks like we make a lot more money on the type 20. And we do per unit of type 20, but we can only make half the number of units of type 20 in that same, the same amount of time. So we can make twice as many units of type 10 in the time it takes us to produce 1 unit of type 20, we can produce 2 units of type 5 or type 10. We could have made this decision really looking at this because the calculations, because the numbers are pretty straightforward. Type 20 takes twice as much time as type 10. Obviously, type 10 and type 5, it's a very clear decision, right? Because type 5 and 10 take the same amount of time, but we make a lot more money on type 10. It's not as clear to us between type 10 and type 20 because they don't take the same amount of time. But type 20 takes twice as much time and we don't make twice as much money. We make less than twice as much. So because the ratios are very easy to see, we really didn't need to go to this extra step. But rarely in life are things as simple as they are in our classroom examples. And so it's important that you understand how to do this last step. How do we maximize the use of the constrained resource or of the bottlenecked resource, the resource that is limiting our productive capacity? In this case, it's a furnace. But especially in today's job market where it is difficult to hire qualified employees to do any job, I keep hearing that from lots of different areas, that people are having trouble finding workers. And so the constrained resource in some settings right now might be the workers. How many hours do we have available to work? So we may have equipment to do the job, but not the workers to run the equipment. So for this exercise then, which product should be emphasized in the marketing and sales campaign in order to maximize profitability? Clearly, the answer is type 10. We've made one assumption in this exercise that I haven't made explicit, and that is we assume that we can sell as much product as we produce. We assume that we have a potentially unlimited demand for our product at our selling price. So we already have determined the selling price because we know what the revenues would be for the 5,000 units. We know what our selling price is. And we assume that whichever one of these three we decide to promote is the one, we can sell it, right? So we don't want to promote type 10 and then exceed, have demand, the quantity demanded exceed the amount we can provide. Because that would be a waste of our marketing dollars if we're advertising something that we then can't sell because we can't produce it. Okay, so this is the end of chapter 5. We are a few, 25, excuse me. We are a few minutes ahead of schedule. Does anyone have anything else you want to talk about before we call it a day? Day 23. All right, well, I'm going to stop the recording.